Welcome, everybody. My name is Jimena Perry. I am your host. And on behalf of the International Federation for Public History and Iona College, the Department of History, I welcome you to today's event. This event is very dear to my heart because today I'm presenting four of great students I had this semester in a class of oral history. They will be presenting like small snippets of their work, and then we will open for questions. This semester was very interesting talking about oral history because, of course, we talked about like the field and how to use oral materials to do history, but we also talked about the nature, its problems, its limitations, about like new outlets we have with oral history, like how to use it, for example, in social media and blog posts, in museums, etc., etc. So as I mentioned before, we're going to give some minutes to each presenter, and then we will open for questions. First, today we have Germán David Diaz. Germán David is a double major in history and education. Then we will go with Devon Fernandez. Devon is also a double major in history and education. Then we'll go with Nicolas Estrada. He is a chemistry major with two minors, one in math and one in history, which is kind of interesting for his take about oral history. And finally, we will have Emily Barker. She's a double major in English and history. So welcome very much. I will ask the people in the audience if you have questions while the presenters are speaking, just put them in the chat and I will read them to them, and to close your mics. And at the end, we can all open our mics and just start the Q&A. Germán David, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Hello, my name is Germán David Diaz, and today I'll be discussing African culture. I'll mostly be discussing the myth of Mwindo, the values associated with the story, and of oral tradition in general. The story is passed on from mouth to mouth, parent to child, going on from generation to generation. It can teach us important morals on how to live our lives. I'll then compare to a well-known hero from our modern-day pop culture, Tony Stark, aka Iron Man from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. At first glance, this makes no sense, but it will by the time I'm done. Lastly, I want to make note that the heroes of ancient stories are just as cool as our modern superheroes. Now, in African folklore, Mwindo is the son of a village chief named Shimwindo, literally meaning Mwindo's father, who rules the village of Tubondo. Shimwindo wants 7 daughters and plans to kill any sons his wives bear. His plan is to gain massive wealth from the bride's wealth payments. When a man wants to take a woman as his bride, the man has to pay the woman's family to allow it. Mwindo's mother gets pregnant with child, who is Mwindo, but remains pregnant even after 9 months, making it difficult for her to do chores while constantly pregnant. Despite still technically not being born, he is still in the womb, Mwindo uses his supernatural gifts to help his mother do his chores, magically levitating the objects to move for her. He then follows this act by being magically born, coming straight out of her middle finger as a child. His most common epithet is he who is born walking and talking, putting great emphasis on his abilities even as a child. He is also born with a magic fly swatter called a conga. Shimwindo is outraged that Mwindo is a boy and throws a spear at him. Mwindo then swats it away with his fly swatter and breaks it with his bare hands. Shimwindo then tries burying Mwindo alive, but it fails as Mwindo digs himself out, singing about his greatness in the process. Shimwindo then traps the child in a drum and throws him into a river. He knows it won't kill him, but he just wants him out of the village. Mwindo is then picked up by his aunt, Iangura, who raised him up to be an adult. When Mwindo grows up, he decides to confront his father. His aunt sends him off with his uncles to confront him. Mwindo's uncles tell him that they will head out first, at which point they are all killed by Shimwindo's men. Enraged, Mwindo charges in and uses his fly swatter to call down lightning strikes on Mwindo's forces. Shimwindo sees his son coming and promptly leaves. Window then uses his magic fly swatter to resurrect all his uncles who died. Window then goes after his father, even going into the underworld to try and get him back. After a few treacherous dealings with the god of the underworld, Window finally manages to find and capture his father. He's so excited that he shows him off around to all the people he passed along the way. Window then reprimands his father for being a lousy dad and banishes him from Tubondo. He then becomes chief of Tubondo. The last part of Window's story involves him fighting off the dragon Kirimu after it ate several of his hunters. Window does battle with him and kills the dragon, retrieving his hunters in the process. Unfortunately, Kirimu was blood brothers with the storm god Nguba. Up to this point, Nguba is the one unleashing the lightning strikes that Window has been calling down. Window then brought up to the heavens and meets up with the various sky gods, all of them lecturing him about his carelessness and arrogance. Window is then sent back to the earth, after agreeing to never kill another creature ever again, and also to calm down and not always jump straight into a fight. The myth of Window begins with a supernatural child who accomplishes great good and great deeds, as both a child and later as a man. The story ends with the main hero living as a fair and just ruler, using his powers as justly as a chief until the end of his days. This story dates back to ancient times and tells of a great hero who faced off monsters. There are other stories of great heroes, such as that. Among my favorites are Beowulf and Heracles. Beowulf starts as a common tavern brawler who then fights off a giant, terrorizing his fellow Thanes. And then he later goes on, becomes king, and dies fighting a deadly dragon. Hercules fought and slew many monsters in his legend: the Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, and the Stevalian birds, just to name a few. What sets the story of Muindo apart from these other stories is some of the explicit morals that the story shows, and the fact that the main character learns a few of them during his journey. First, no child is imperfect. They were made by God and no parent should reject them due to disability or gender. Second, courage is good, but carelessness is bad. It can lead to disaster and chaos if used in abundance. Third, help each other. Men was not made to be alone and should help one another to survive. And fourth, you should not be arrogant in your own power, as there will be others who are better than you. Window exemplifies the first and third morals, taking care of his family and friends while punishing Shim Window for his crimes. He comes to learn the second and fourth morals after slaying Karimu and being brought up to the sky to be lectured by the gods. His story was passed down in oral tradition, passing from generation to generation, telling of his deeds and his crimes, warning those against making the same mistakes. The story of Tony Stark from the MCU is a different matter. It begins with the first Iron Man movie and ends with his death in Avengers Endgame. He starts off as a playboy billionaire who made his fortune making weapons. After getting kidnapped by terrorists and seeing how his weapons are causing death and war, he builds a suit of armor and escapes, losing a friend along the way. After returning to society, he ends all weapon-making contracts. He also uses his Iron Man suit to take down the terrorists that his weapons were used by. Over the course of several movies, he continues his heroics. He joins the Avengers in defense of New York against aliens, stops Ultron from wiping out the planet, fights off more terrorists, then fights off more aliens hunting for the Infinity Stones. When Thanos gets the stones and makes a snap, half of life disappears from the universe. For the next 5 years, he lived peacefully with his wife and daughter. He then goes back in time to retrieve the stones and bring back everyone who disappeared from the snap. In the final battle between the Avengers and Thanos, Tony sacrifices himself to end Thanos and dies shortly after. His legend is remembered by all those who came before. In Tony's story, we can draw on a few other mortals. First, and foremost, take responsibility for your actions. They can affect people in good and bad ways. When Tony learned of his actions leading to war instead of peace, he stopped producing weapons and used his suit to remove the weapons still in use. If you cause someone harm, do your best to correct it. 2, help each other. Throughout the movies, Tony has been acting in his own way to try and help those as much as he can. He's not always the best at showing it, but he always does, especially in the case of his daughter. Both stories show characters with power, either supernaturally born or gained via research and engineering, and use them for good. Both learn life lessons in relation to their power. Window learns to calm down and not abuse his power in conflict. He doesn't learn until the gods themselves drag him up to the sky to gain a clearer perspective on life. Tony learned to take responsibility for his creations and acts to correct his mistakes. Throughout the Marvel movies, he is constantly trying to correct the wrongs that he has caused, either intentionally or otherwise, and in the end, sacrifices the future so that others could have theirs. The stories that we hear can inspire us to do good and be genuine, honest, and morally good people. Failing that, they show us how to always try to do so. No one is perfect, and people will always make their mistakes. It is a matter of how we live and learn with those mistakes. Wayndo was a prodigy from birth who used his powers to help his mother before he was even born. He used his abilities to their fullest without restraint for most of his life until he learned humility and restraint directly from the gods. Tony Stark was unaware of his mistakes until he was directly confronted with them, and then, following that, he begins fixing them as the beginning of his path to become a hero, all the way up to his death. Both heroes teach us important life lessons by the way they lived, the mistakes they made, and how they died. Legends are told, heroes are made, and lessons are learned by those who hear them. And that is my pitch for why ancient stories about mythical heroes and monsters are just as cool as modern stories about superheroes. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Herman David. I have actually some questions, but I'm going to wait until to hear all of the presentations, but thank you. It was great. Now let's go with Devon Fernandez. Devon has a presentation that I will share with you.
Thank you, Jimena. Yes, so my presentation, everyone, will be on how to interview someone and how to determine who would be a good candidate for an interview. I think everyone here will have been through a job interview, but in terms of oral history, sometimes it's different when determining who should be a perfect candidate. And obviously there's different criteria that make someone a good candidate. I'll go through a specific example and different good and bad candidates and why they are good or bad for the role of the interviewer. So obviously, first of all, you have to determine how you're going to conduct the interview. That's the first step. And yes, that depends a lot of times on the candidate that you do choose to interview. If you have someone that's an expert in a certain field, you might want to ask them questions about that field. But once you've determined how you want to interview the person and the topics you'd like to cover, you have to determine who you want to interview. So moving on from the how, some things that we have to consider before we conduct any interviews. First of all, interviews are usually not, I put often not, but usually not as clean cut as we would hope. It's impossible to predict what's going to happen during an interview. Different questions might be answered differently than how the interviewer that's conducting the interview might expect them to be answered. That has to be considered. On top of that, the interviewer has to prepare well for the interview. But even with the best preparation, sometimes things just don't go well. Jimena once told us a story about an interview that didn't go well for her. And yes, it can be very frustrating for anyone that's conducting research. But at the same time, we must accept everybody's different. And sometimes things cannot be planned, simply put. So the topic that I've decided I will focus on, I picked kind of randomly, was the election of 2000. Obviously, for those of you that don't know, Al Gore was a Democratic candidate for president in the election of 2000, while George W. Bush be specific, was a Republican candidate in that election, and he became president, having won that election. There was a scandal at the end revolving around how the votes were counted in the state of Florida. And obviously, at the end of the day, George W. Bush did win the election. Al Gore did concede, but the thesis that we're going to focus on, if I were to conduct a oral history project on this topic, is how did this election have an effect on future elections? And that's what it says on the next slide. Because there's different ways to determine who is a legitimate president. Okay. However, I'm not going to answer that question over the course of this presentation. I'm just going to focus on the different candidates that could have been potentially interviewed by someone that would conduct a project based on this thesis. So next slide, please. So these are just three pictures of three people that have been affected by this election to some degree. Al Gore is pictured left, obviously the former president, Donald J. Trump in the middle, and Hillary Clinton, who lost in the 2016 presidential election on the right. All of them have lost elections, and all of them have eventually conceded their election losses. However, each of them had a somewhat legitimate, or claimed to be legitimate, claim to be the real president after the election. So, going on to the next topic. Would the following people be good candidates for this interview, or for an interview on the topic at hand? 2000 presidential election. So the first candidate, Clarence Thomas. Those of you who don't know, he is a current Supreme Court justice. He was chosen to succeed Thurgood Marshall, who's the first African-American Supreme Court justice, as a Supreme Court justice in 1991. He was chosen by George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, which could be somewhat problematic as well. And most importantly, Clarence Thomas is still on the Supreme Court to this day. That will prove to be one of the key points as determining whether he's a good candidate or not. Moving on. So this is why he may be a bad interview candidate. The good, obviously, he is an expert that lived through the case at hand and could potentially give good input on the case. However, there are some glaring issues, which is, first of all, he might not be willing to share all of his ideas about the thesis since he's still currently in office, and it could hinder his post as a Supreme Court justice. He also might not be willing to say as much just because of his ties to the Bushes, for instance. And lastly, he's going to be, because of his current job, hard to reach, and it's going to be relatively hard to ask him effective questions since he's limited in what he can say. Therefore, he's just going to be a hard candidate to interview. And there is a better candidate that we're going to come to next. But first, a quote from Donald Swain in his article, Problems for Practitioners of Oral History. The most valuable oral testimony, I think, tends to come from men who, though not widely known, have been deeply involved in important matters. Their names will be obvious in the written records. Some of the most useful oral evidence I received, for example, came from a man who was neither a scientist nor a politician. His interviews include interviews on the John F. Kennedy assassination and the John F. Kennedy presidency. And as stated in that article, sometimes the best people he can get for interviews have been people that worked on the campaign teams for presidential elections, people that lived near or with presidents, or people involved in the research. So for instance, maybe a housekeeper or a maid, and people that knew the people at hand and knew the situation and lived through it directly. So for the topic at hand, Charles Burson was the first person that I was able to find that I thought would be a very good candidate. Charles Burson, you can find him on Wikipedia. Again, it should be someone that's relatively well-known, but not well-known to the point that it's going to be hard to access that person. He was the chief of staff to Al Gore when Al Gore lost that election in 2000 and when he was vice president under former President Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Currently, Charles Burson is a legal specialist and a professor in Washington State, while he's also studying photojournalism and pursuing a potential career in that field going forward, and continues to follow ongoing political events. One of his first photojournalist works was involving the 2016 presidential election, which is connected with the topic at hand because it was, again, a questionable ending to an election. So the things that make him a good candidate, like I said, he's relatively available. He's someone that is not currently in a political office. He is a professor, so you can find his email online and you can easily reach out to him. I'm sure he would be of interest for a project revolving around the election of 2000. Since he's also involved in the subject area to this day, he still researches modern day elections and discusses them, I'm sure, with his classes. And he was directly involved in that event. Yes, he was swayed towards one side as he worked on the Gore administration. However, he still presents a good candidate just because he lived and worked in the event itself and might have an interesting take on the event. It's going to be very hard to find an interview candidate that is completely unbiased. That's a given. So find someone that will be involved but may not be as directly involved as someone like, say, the candidate themselves. Long and short of it, like I said, no candidate for an interview is perfect. Every candidate has flaws and benefits. Depends on which ones the interviewer themselves wants to highlight. And so long as interviews are planned well and the candidates chosen wisely, they can provide good information and key information that may even sway the thesis of the researcher themselves. Some people are simply more open and accessible than others. That's usually due to post or role or even just leanings. And lastly, it's important that we remain open-minded to all perspectives when conducting an interview, unless the researcher themselves decides that they want to focus on one specific point. And as well, we must listen to the expertise of the person being interviewed. We should never belittle or look down upon the people we are interviewing, since everyone is an expert in something and they can all offer us some good knowledge. The last slide is just the image sources. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you, Devon, so much. I think you addressed a very interesting point, because oral historians, we are always finding people to interview, and deciding who to interview is always a challenge, and it's part of the research. So I think that's very interesting, and I have some questions for you again, but I want to hear the four of you, and then we'll go to the round of questions. So now, Nicholas, you have the floor.
I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. Can you all see it?
Mhm.
Oops. Present. You all can, right? Hello?
We hear you.
Yep.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. So as Devin focused more so on who's a good candidate to interview, I focus more so on my presentation on what makes a good oral history interview. So with this, there's 3 different types of interviews one can conduct when performing an oral history interview. One is an unstructured interview, the second is a semi-structured interview, and the third is a structured interview. With this, an unstructured interview is when there are very few questions, and the questions are more like a conversation back and forth rather than a question being answered and then another question being performed. These unstructured interviews, however, are more time consuming because they're more open-ended questions, and they work best though, however, when the topic being discussed is something that someone might find a sensitive topic or could cause trauma to build up in the person being interviewed. The second type of interview is a semi-structured interview. This is when the interview has several questions and is more like a guided conversation, because the questions are formatted in a way that are structured, but they are still open-ended questions where the person will respond with, say, a paragraph per se, or a short answer before the interviewer will ask the participant another question. The third type of interview one can conduct is a structured interview. This is when there are a lot of questions, and the questions being asked are formatted in a way that the person being interviewed can respond quickly. Some examples of these questions would be yes or no questions, true or false questions, or questions that are easily answered in a sentence or two. How to prepare to interview someone. So the first thing, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is to know what type of interview you want to conduct. This is important, whether it's a structured, unstructured, or semi-structured interview. With that in mind, it is important to go and gather your own research about the topic you want to learn more about before looking for people to interview, because then you can find which people search specifically more so your topic than others. Thirdly, it is important to plan out the questions being asked during the interview that you want to do. This is because it allows you to structure what type of interview you want to conduct. Fourthly, and most importantly, in my opinion, it's important to gain consent of the participant in the interview, whether that be if you want to record them or you just want to have the audio recorded, or you want to present your findings later on in some sort of way. It is important to gain consent because then you're allowed to do all these things. And the last and final thing is to be engaged when you're interviewing someone. You want to make the interviewee feel important and that you can relate to them, and you don't want to be distracted by outside resources. So you want to be in an enclosed environment and limited to possible distractions. There are always problems that could arise during an interview. Some problems are that the person doesn't want to, doesn't live near you. It's funny now that we're all on Zoom due to COVID, and because of this, there's all these resources that it doesn't hinder you. If someone doesn't live near you, you can still interview them online. Another problem that could arise is that the interviewer changes their mind and they don't want to do the interview anymore. You can always look for someone else to interview, but if you do want this specific person, there might be a way to compensate them, whether that be giving them some incentive or financially support them in order to conduct the interview. This is done from time to time. You can see in documentaries, they'll blur someone's face or change the audio so the person being interviewed is protected, but they still get the point across. The person you're interviewing doesn't stop talking. They ramble on about whatever they want to talk about instead, and it's not what you want your interview to be. So you can politely interrupt them and get them back on course and tell them a more related question that you want to have answered about what is being conducted. The final problem that I can think of is that the person being interviewed becomes very upset. This can be resolved depending on the type of interview or the topic being discussed. So, some examples might be a survivor of some violent action that might arise, and you want to learn more about the topic. So in return, you want to comfort them, have tissues on hand, and anything else to help them, and still get you and them through the interview together. It's important when you're conducting interviews to get multiple perspectives about the situation. This is because every person remembers an event differently, and they might be on a different side of the thing that occurred or the thing you want to look at. So by getting multiple perspectives, you can see the full story that arises as a result of this. To present your interview to future things, many ways you can present your interviews are documentaries, podcasts, YouTube videos. You could publish a book, create an archive, or make a play or make a movie, which are very prevalent nowadays. Thank you so much. Any questions? And then those are my sources to all the photos I used.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. It was a great presentation. I think you captured like the whole thing we discussed during the whole semester. You were able to condense it very well in this presentation. It was great. Thank you. So now let's go with Emily. Can you stop sharing, please?
Yes. Just give me a second. How do you stop sharing?
Done.
Okay, thank you.
Done. Done. Okay, so now let's go with Emily Barker. Emily, the floor is yours.
All right, I'm just going to need a moment to get set up.
If meanwhile somebody has questions or comments, I invite you to write them in the chat. And then I will read them to the students. While Emily sets up, I am going to take the opportunity to invite you to our next Explorers event that's taking place on May 11. And it's again with a group of students, but this time from Macquarie University, Australia. They are history majors and archaeology majors. And we are going to talk about public history for young audiences. So maybe the time zones are a little bit funny, but if you can make it, it will also be a great opportunity to learn what students are thinking about public history.
Just to let you know, Emily, we can see your screen share.
I was just about to ask if you could see my screen. Excellent.
Yes, yes.
All right, then let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Barker, and today I will be presenting on the role of oral history in museums. So first, let's reflect on how oral history museums can be used as a tool, because after all, our presentation today is called Oral History, Tools and Legacies. So earlier in the semester, I actually presented on the process of decolonizing the museum. So for those who may be unfamiliar with the term, decolonizing the museum means making the museum a more inclusive space. It helps the museum show more respect for the culture which is being presented, but it also helps show more respect to the attendees as well. Oral history plays a key part in the process of decolonizing the museum, since it encourages people to tell their stories and collect testimonies from a diverse array of people. Oral history can also make the museum a more interactive space, since it may encourage visitors to share their stories. Additionally, hearing the stories of real people will get people to engage in a way that they wouldn't normally with events with which they are unfamiliar. Finally, oral histories can make museums more personal. A big misconception about museums is that they are stoic, unchanging, serious experiences presented by expert curators for an audience of fellow experts. For many people, it can be difficult to engage with museums since they feel museums are elitist and out of touch. Oral history adds a personal element to museums and shows that they are not just spaces for experts, but that the experiences being presented happen to real people and they are discussing something important to them. This makes audiences more comfortable with both the museums as it is deferring to those who know best, as well as being more comfortable with potentially heavy topics. Oral history also provides the benefit of adding an individual's internal perspective on an event which happened externally and is known to have happened. Going down into the details of what happened also helps museums feel more personal. Conversely, museums themselves are a tool for oral history. Oral history is an inherently is inherently intangible and unique to the individual. A museum with a large number of resources will be able to interview a good number of people to preserve their stories. The museum can then act as an archive for these stories. One of the fundamental requirements for oral history is that there has to be a listener. Museums ensure that these oral histories reach a wider audience than usual and use the oral histories to educate the audience and expand their view on a particular event. Now that I've gone into the fundamentals of how oral history in a museum could work, I would like to show a case study of how it can be successfully implemented into a museum. Let me introduce you to the War Childhood Museum. The War Childhood Museum was established in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina in the summer of 2015. The museum is the result of the research of Jasminko Alilovic. He was writing a book about children growing up during the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995. The Bosnian War was brutal and saw about 100,000 people killed and 2 million displaced. Alilovic thought it was especially important to gather the testimonies of children who had been affected by the war. When interviewing the now adult survivors, Alilovic found that many of them still had mementos from their war-stricken childhood, though many had lost their childhood items due to relocation. This fueled his passion to create a permanent space for these objects. In his founder's statement on the website, he states, "The creation of this museum is important, not only for the permanent preservation of memories of war childhood, but also because the museum will, unlike other war museums, document the experience of those who played no role in the start of the war and still suffered multiple consequences." Children's stories are particularly important for their potential and suitability to serve as a basis for advancing mutual understanding, which is essential for the reconciliation process. 10 years after the opening, the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo will be the world's largest archive dedicated to the experience of growing up during the war. So, the main goal of the War Childhood Museum is to gather the objects and stories of children affected by war. How do they accomplish this, and what role does oral history play? First, they collect and catalog items that survivors of war have donated to the museum. Then, they interview children who grew up or are currently growing up during war about various aspects of the war. Something they do in their research process, which is particularly beneficial, is they have all their researchers trained by psychologists on, quote, how to adequately communicate the sensitive issues, how to build the appropriate rapport, and how to guide the interview process. The actual interview process itself starts with a questionnaire of 200 multiple choice and open-ended questions. This helps refresh the participants' memory and puts them in the mindset of the questions they need to answer. It also preps the participants for the kinds of questions they may be asked. The questionnaire also helps the researchers get as much information as possible without potentially re-traumatizing participants by having them retell stories of atrocities they faced. Then, the formal interview happens. It is recorded on video. Participants may be asked about life now, life before the war, beginning of the war, displacement, housing, living conditions, security, experience of shelling and sniper fire, family life, friendships, school, leisure time, and hobbies, the experience of UN soldiers and foreign journalists coming, wounding and losses, the most remarkable events, the end of the war, the way war childhood affects their present life, and the way how the person thinks and feels about the ongoing conflicts in the war. So the War Childhood Museum has used this technique successfully on a number of different projects. The project was inspired by survivors of the Bosnian War. However, children of all wars, regardless of ethnic or racial status, are invited to share their stories and objects to the museum. Two of their other projects are on Syrian children refugees and Ukrainian children affected by the conflict, starting with the invasion of Crimea in 2014. The museum also curates its sources in a variety of ways. The museum has a permanent collection based in Sarajevo, but also has traveling exhibitions across mainly the United States and Europe, though they are actually going to bring their project on Syrian children to Lebanon. They also use social media and have launched campaigns, one of these campaigns was #Children and Genocide, and it was used to raise awareness for those who may be unfamiliar with the topic, or for those who may be unfamiliar with the museum or unable to go to the museum or traveling exhibitions. So the War Childhood Museum utilizes a more traditional permanent space, as well as extremely modern techniques such as pop-up exhibitions and social media to share the stories of children growing up during war. Now that we have reflected on the first half of the title, the tools of oral history, it is now time to briefly look at the second, the legacy of oral history. So there are two main ties to legacy that oral history museums have. The first is the legacies of the participants. The stories the participants choose to share will be preserved and can act as a legacy for them. For the War Childhood Museum specifically, the legacy of the participants is raising awareness through their stories of their own war-stricken childhoods. Additionally, the stories of those who were lost or perished during the wars are also preserved, sharing their legacies with a larger number of people. Oral history in museums may also have a legacy in and of itself. Since projects like the War Childhood Museum are still relatively new, projects like it that are able to successfully integrate oral history into museums and educate others with it may become a roadmap for future projects and may even inspire others initially reticent to utilize oral history to give it a try. This would preserve even more stories about more events that need to be remembered, especially from an individual's perspective. Thank you for listening. I will actually put the link to the website of the World Childhood Museum in the chat. And I strongly encourage you to look at it and see firsthand how amazing their work is. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, very, very much. That's a topic your topic is one of my favorites. So thank you for your presentation. I would like to invite people from the audience to open their mics and have questions. Or if you don't want to open your mic, you can write your questions in the chat and I will read them for Herman David, Devon, Nicholas, and Emily. And while you decide to ask or not, I would like to ask them some questions. I would like to start with Herman David. Herman David, I would like you to tell us, why did you choose this particular stories that you told us to illustrate oral history? How do you relate that with oral history?
I thought about the idea of oral histories. Stories are often told with the intent to teach us about the culture, you can learn about the culture. You can also learn certain life lessons through the acts of characters throughout those stories. So I thought about connecting the traditions of the past, the actions of those, to the morals that they said. I also decided that one due to the specific amounts of morals both taught within the story of Muindo, as well as those taught that he himself learns. And I thought about comparing it to a modern pop culture story, which can also be passed on in oral tradition in later years.
Yes, I think your examples were great. I enjoyed it immensely, and I think you touch on a very important topic, like also oral traditions that pass to one generation to another. They're also like teaching tools. They let people like to know how to act in their own cultural context. So that was very good, Herman David. Thank you very much. And I have a question for Devon. You mentioned, Devon, that I mentioned one time in class that interviews can go wrong. And yes, of course, they can go very, very wrong. You showed like a logical process to choose an ideal or a good interviewee, but what would you do yourself? Put yourself in the shoes of an interviewer that something goes completely wrong, what would you do? How do you think you would react?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it depends on the context of the interview, the topic especially. If you're talking about something particularly traumatic and it goes the wrong way, it could really make the point of the interview get lost. But I think, for instance, in the case that I presented, which was chosen kind of arbitrarily, just as something relatively recent, which most people know something about, I would say if the interview goes wrong, try to refocus it, or if there are valuable points being brought up by the other person, even if the interviewer maybe isn't trying to focus on those points or isn't agree or disagree with them in any way, allow the person to speak to some degree. But once you get to a certain point where you need to refocus it and you do need to get to the point, just kindly redirect that person. And if they can't be redirected well, then maybe just choose another person to interview. That can sometimes be the best case scenario. But ideally, refocus the interview in a nice and polite way where you're not getting aggressive or angry towards the person. And most people respond well to that kind of thing, I think.
That was going to be my follow-up question. What if you interview someone that has political views radically different from yours and you start to feel like it's getting to your bones? So that could be a challenge, and we have to be, like, as you mentioned, like professional enough until a certain degree to let them speak, but then try to redirect and also try to maintain ourselves as, I don't like the word, but like objective as possible, if that's even possible, but like not to engage it in something that could end in the wrong way. So thank you. Nicholas, you mentioned at the end of your presentation, like different ways to show the interview. I mean, you referred to in your presentation, like, okay, interviews are important, but also the way to show them. What would be like a preferred way for you to curate an interview, a podcast, an article? How would you do that?
I think it depends what topic you want to discuss firstly, and then you go from there. Like me personally, I prefer documentaries. I think they're the most like you can learn the most in the shortest and quickest amount of time, and they're more so straight to the point on it. But it depends what the topic is. Like if you feel as if that it's kind of like a fun topic, like you just decided to interview your friend about something that you find interesting, I feel like a YouTube video or a podcast is more fitting for this. While if you're trying to make something it's something historical and you want to get as accurate as possible, a documentary or maybe a movie or something, or an art writing an article or something is more professional, and it's that type of interview more so. So I think it really depends upon what topic you're interviewing someone on.
What do you think about, for example, new, well, not new for me, but perhaps not for you, like TikTok or those kinds of social media to produce some kind of content related to oral history? Do you think they would be effective or not?
I don't think they would be as effective because TikTok, for example, I believe you only get up to a minute of content to post, and then you have to post it. So in a minute of time, you can't squeeze like everything into that as efficiently. But YouTube, I know YouTube is kind of older now. You can make a YouTube video as long as you want. So that's more fitting with new technology, I guess.
Thank you. Danny Y. Bellinger. Hi, Danny. Thank you for being here. He says that now TikTok, it's up to 3 minutes. Okay.
Oh, okay. So I guess,
Yeah.
I guess that's a little better then.
Yeah, a little. Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. Emily, you touched upon a topic that has been always not problematic, but makes me think a lot. And it's when you talk about oral history related to children and atrocities and related to children. Like, I think I think it's a special challenge to interview kids about atrocities and remembrances like that. After seeing the War Museum and what they do, what do you think? How would you approach asking children about those kinds of remembrances? What would you do? You, Emily Barker, how would you go on that?
Oh, wow. Well, definitely first, one of the things I really like that they did, and I don't know how unique this is in like the oral history, I kind of like that they worked with psychologists as well. So it's like two types of academics coming together to try and determine what the best process is. So I would definitely start off by doing my research and potentially even seeking out professional training like they did. Second, I think then you should like definitely try and not bombard them with like very hard questions. That's true for any oral history as well, but I feel like better to like at least start off asking about like some of the topics, like, well, what was life like before the war? Who are your friends? What was your family life like? What was school like? Maybe then like getting into some of the heavier topics, such as like what happened to school and family and friends when the war started. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Emily. We have a few minutes to ask more questions. I don't know if you, among the four of you, you have questions for each other. If you would like to touch upon, oh, Danny, I'm sorry. Danny, please, you can open your mic and do the question.
Yes, hi, can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear
All
you
right.
fine.
Awesome. So my question is slightly self-serving, but still, I think might be relevant. I just wanted to, and I missed part of the beginning part, so it might have been already mentioned. I'm sorry if my question is not that relevant because of that. But in any case, I was wondering what you folks would think about bringing objects that might trigger memories within interviews. So for instance, I work on video game history, and one of the ways I'm thinking of doing it is using oral history. And so for the history of a specific game, I would think of having, let's say I'm studying one game in particular, bring a copy of that game so that the person could play it, and then that might trigger some memories. You know, there's other ways, pictures and whatever. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on bringing these things within the oral history interview.
Before we continue, just a disclosure, Danny is the person who processed all the Explorers videos, so thank you. Thank you. Now, who wants to answer his question? Oh, go, everybody, go. Herman David and then Emily.
I think the idea has potential to possibly arouse certain emotions from the people, but it would be cautious as to whether those questions are good or bad. But I think it might be effective in maybe jogging their memory, although certain objects wouldn't be brought in depending on what the object is, like bringing weapons that they might have seen being used in violence. That would be a less than stellar idea, but bringing something like a journal from their parents or something positively related to them or their culture would probably be acceptable.
I definitely think it's a good thought, like a good idea, because it seems to be a successful model for the War Childhood Museum, because a lot of the people who are being interviewed there are the same people who are donating objects to the museum. So I think maybe having them bring in objects that are pertinent to them and their experiences would be a good foundation for like maybe where the interview could start.
I have another question, but I want to also address Danny's question very fast. I have had that discussion before, and sometimes those objects work really good, but sometimes they raise so much like emotions and feelings in people that they haven't been able to be done. I'm thinking about an example. I talked to my students last semester about a towel of a particular guerrilla leader in Colombia, which is my country. The towel wasn't, we couldn't display the towel because people reacted so badly, like how to glorify a guerrilla leader in a museum, and it couldn't be done. So perhaps it's a matter of time, or I mean, it depends, but it was just an example. I have a question here for Herman David. Hello, this is Tudias or anyone who could answer. My question is, how would you employ such oral traditions that you mentioned while writing a story about a society with no written records? Because mainstream history writing essentially focuses on empiricism.
Ideally, I would possibly look into the storytellers who wrote that, maybe get some information on how they learned it, background on them, and maybe what their culture is like, and perhaps create written records from that, although it might be subject to certain biases.
Does anybody, because the question itself says to Diaz or anyone who would answer. So anybody wants to compliment, not compliment, but compliment Herman David's answer? To do a follow-up on that? We have 2 minutes left. No? Oh, sorry.
To it, I would say, I think it depends on the individual culture and making sure that the norms of that culture are being respected. Obviously, translations sometimes are never going to be perfectly clean cut and clear. So writing down a story in English from, say, a tribe in the Amazon rainforest that doesn't speak any written form of language is going to be difficult. But I think so long as their traditions are respected and the morals of the story are not either exaggerated or underdone, I think that it can be done well.
Well, thank you. We still have time for one question. One. And if we don't have any more questions, I would just like to thank you. I would like to thank Herman, David, Devon, Nicholas, and Emily. Your presentations were very engaging. I appreciate them very much. Of course, I am totally biased. I like them all. I thank you, and I wish to see you again in this Explorers event. I do this every month. As I told you before, everybody is invited, and have a good summer, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.